Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
The little Rhodes boy, Sylvie, had died. Two women, with red eyes from crying, left Mrs. Rhodes's house. One wore a long fur coat, and the other had only a short gray shawl and slippers. One woman was young, and the other was older, but both looked tired and sad. The morning light was dim, and the snow covered the ground. Smoke started to rise from some chimneys, and the cold air smelled like burning wood. "You're tired," said the older woman, Mrs. Rawls. "So are you," said the younger woman, Helen. "I'm used to it," said Mrs. Rawls. "I haven't rested in 35 years, since my son Jimmy was born." They continued walking, talking about little Sylvie and how sweet he had been. Sylvie had always been kind, helping people in the neighborhood. Both women couldn't believe he was gone. He had been everything to his mother, and it felt wrong that such a good child should die. When they arrived at Mrs. Rawls's house, she invited Helen inside. The house was small and simple, but Helen felt comforted. Mrs. Rawls gave her a cup of coffee and made her rest on a sofa. Helen hadn't been taken care of in years, as she was usually the one helping others. As Helen lay there, she thought about her old friend and Rhodes, and had gone through many troubles, losing family and money. Despite their different lives, Helen had always liked Anne. Sylvie and son had been special to Helen. His smile and kindness reminded Helen of a child she had lost many years ago. She didn't expect that taking Sylvie home in her carriage a week ago would be the last time she saw him alive. Now, Helen felt glad that she had stayed with and during Sylvie's final days, helping with what she could. The memory of Sylvie brought back old, painful feelings, but also sweet memories, and she couldn't stop the tears from falling. Helen wondered if her husband knew she had been away. They spent so little time together now, and he had gone on a trip. Only Kathleen, her husband's sister, was at home. Helen felt worried. Kathleen had fallen in love with James Sanderfield, a man who worked at the hat factory. Helen thought it was strange and unfortunate. She didn't understand why Kathleen liked him so much. Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard Mrs. Rawls singing a soft hymn in the kitchen, and Helen soon fell asleep, remembering Sylvie's warm little hand helping her cross the street. An hour later, a friend arrived, but Mrs. Rawls stopped her from entering the room. "Mrs. Armstrong is asleep," she said. "She's very tired from watching over Sylvie. I sent the coachman back so she can rest." "It's hard to believe Sylvie is gone," said the friend. "So many people have been asking about him. Squire Peters even sent someone to check on Mrs. Rhodes. Everybody wants to help." Another woman joined them and said, "I don't understand why God took Sylvie, such a sweet boy, but left old Grandpa Slade, who is almost 90 and never helped anyone." A third woman arrived, saying, "Grandpa Slade is crying about Sylvie. He says he should have died instead. Amelia is worried he might do something bad." The women looked worried, but one of them, Mrs. Beebe, said, "I'll send my son to bring Grandpa to our house for a nice meal. That will cheer him up." Mrs. Rawls agreed to join them, but said she needed to stop by Emma Taylor's house first because her baby was sick. She went to Emma's small, white house. Emma, looking tired, greeted her at the door with a baby in her arms and two young children holding her skirt. "We're doing fine," she said happily to Mrs. Rawls. "Come in. You'll be surprised to see John at home during the day. He's staying home because of Mrs. Rhodes." The bachelor boys brought her wood, and Mr. Fellows's driver shoveled the snow, but we thought she might want to know there's a man nearby if she needs help. "Let me hold the baby, Emma," her husband said. "You're tired." He took the baby and held him close. "The baby didn't sleep much last night, but we didn't mind. We're so happy to have him. Do you see his light curls? Emma and I think he looks like Sylvie, Mrs. Rawls." "I think so too," said Mrs. Rawls as she got ready to leave. "Must you go, Mrs. Rawls? If you see Mrs. Rhodes, tell her John is staying home, so she knows someone is here if she needs help." Mrs. Rawls hurried home, thinking, Helen must be awake now. Helen woke up in the quiet house. She looked around, not knowing where she was at first. She heard a loud clock ticking and a kettle singing. She was about to fall asleep again when she heard a knock at the door. She quickly got up and went to the kitchen. A tall man was there. He had dark eyes and a serious face. She knew him, even though they had never spoken before. It was James Sandersfield. "I'm sorry," he said. "I came to see Mrs. Rawls. Mrs. Rhodes sent for her. She's not here right now, but she'll be back soon," Helen said. "Mrs. Rhodes wants Mrs. Rawls to come when she can," he explained. "Is she okay?" Helen asked. "She's very quiet now. I didn't expect to see her this morning, but she sent for me," he said, looking sad. "I carried Sylvie downstairs for her. She said it helped her to have me do it." "I loved the child," he added softly. "I'm glad you were there," Helen said. "It must have helped her a lot." James looked like he wanted to say more, but instead, he turned to leave. "Good morning," he said, and left. Helen didn't reply, thinking about Kathleen. Mrs. Rawls was happy Helen had slept for a long time. The sleigh was waiting outside for Helen again. "Tell Mrs. Rhodes I'll come later," she said as she got into the sleigh. The coachman stopped for some teams to pass. A big, bearded man walked up to her. He looked sad. "I saw the white ribbons on the door. It's not the little boy with the light curls who has died, is it?" he asked. "Oh, it is," said Helen with tears in her eyes. The man took off his hat and stood in the snow. "He was one of God's own," he said quietly. "He was known by everyone here. Just 2 weeks ago, he brought home Mike O'Brien's little girl when she was sick. Tell his mother that my friends and I will help her in any way we can. There's no other work to do in this weather. If you come to Lawndale this afternoon, Mr. Armstrong can help you find a job," said Helen quickly. "Do you know the big stone house with the pillars?" "Yes, that one. I'll tell Mrs. Rhodes. Let's go, Benson." The big, quiet house was very different from the small, crowded house she had been in for 2 days. The silence felt strange. It had been a long time since she felt so alive, thinking about other people's joys and sadness. She was happy when her maid, Margaret, asked her about little Sylvie. Helen answered kindly and gave Margaret some medicine for her cold. "What is it, Margaret?" she asked, noticing that the girl wanted to say something. Margaret paused. Mrs. Armstrong, we all feel so sad for this sweet child that's gone. May God help his mother. Tomorrow is my day off, but I was thinking, ma'am, if it's okay, I could wear my clean cap and apron and help at the house. I could open the door for the people who will come, so everything is nice for her. You are a good girl, Margaret, said Helen, touched by her kindness. Yes, you can go. Later, Kathleen came in. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and her dark hair was messy. She kissed her sister-in-law and sat by the fire. Helen looked at her, thinking about James Sanderfield. She tried to imagine him with Kathleen, but it still felt strange. I just came from the country club, said Kathleen, covering her face from the fire. What did you do? Play golf in the snow. We tried, but it didn't work. We sat by the fire and talked. But, sister, aren't you tired? Were you up all night? I was up all night, said Helen, but I'm not tired. I've been home for a while. And Mrs. Rhodes? I left her very quiet. We talked about little Sylvie all morning, said Kathleen sadly. It's so awful for her to lose her child. She doesn't have anyone else. She isn't very young, is she? She's about my age. Well, that's not old, but why does she have so many troubles? Mrs. Harper said she has always been good and kind, even though her husband wasn't nice and she lost her money. She never complained. Why did this terrible thing happen to her? Why was her sweet child taken away? It doesn't seem fair. I don't understand it either, said Helen softly. She put her hand on her heart and smiled a little, remembering her own past sadness. We almost cried. Kathleen continued. All the girls. Harvey Spencer tried to make us laugh with jokes, but they were bad jokes. Oh, he was so silly. I don't like those society men. But we couldn't stop talking about Mrs. Rhodes. Everyone wants to help her. Mary Barber said little Sylvie was taken because his mother loved him too much, and it's wrong to love someone that much. I don't believe that. You can't love someone too much. People forget what love is. You and Orrin think I'm silly and romantic, but love is what makes life worth living. I will always love as much as I can, even if it hurts. Kathleen moved closer and laid her head in Helen's lap. He will let you, Helen said, her voice shaky. Kathleen looked up at her, and their eyes met. Helen thought about a man carrying a little child, and she wanted to tell Kathleen, but was too shy. Maybe he wasn't so bad after all. Later, Helen told Orrin what she thought about James Sanderfield. Orrin frowned. It's what I expected, he said. There's nothing wrong with the man, but I still don't see why Kathleen wants him. Well, it's Kathleen's happiness that matters, not ours, said Helen. What are you looking at? Orrin was looking at a small, faded photo of a little child. He stared at it quietly. I always liked this one more than the big portrait, he said slowly. You haven't had it out for a while. No, Helen replied. The frame needed fixing, and the picture was so faded that it made me sad. But today, oh, Orrin, I wanted someone to remember. I never forgot, he said. I just get so busy. I gave $1,000 to the Children's Hospital today for little Sylvie and for our child. Oh, Helen, I won't let you go again tonight. But it has helped me more than anything, she said. I've been trapped in my sadness. I'm not crying just for sorrow, Oren. There's so much more. And now I must go. A man is waiting downstairs for work, and I'll say goodbye until tomorrow. When Helen got to her friend's house, she saw the clergyman leaving. It was snowing again, and he helped her out of the sleigh. Mrs. Rhodes said she was expecting you, he said. Did you see her? Yes, for a few minutes, he replied, looking up the street. Judge Shillaber was just here. I was surprised because he never goes out. But everyone feels this sadness. The ways of the Lord are very mysterious, he said with a heavy sigh. We must have more faith, Mrs. Armstrong. Yes, I feel that too, said Helen. I wanted to talk more, but I mustn't keep you. There's Mrs. Rawls. Another time. The clergyman hurried away, and Helen was welcomed by Mrs. Rawls into a small, warm dining room filled with the smell of flowers. We've had such a time, whispered Mrs. Rawls. Me, Mrs. Loomis, and Ellen Grant have been so busy with visitors. Ellen's so deaf, but she stayed by the window, telling us when someone came. Mrs. Dunham helped for a while. The whole town has come by, people Mrs. Rhodes doesn't even know. They've brought food and flowers, so much food. But she won't eat anything. And flowers. From big white lilies to a small sprig of pink geranium, a little girl brought for little Moss Sylvie. The girl was crying. I gave her some broth before she left. Some notes say, for Sylvie's mother, and she likes those the most. The child looks so peaceful. She put the geranium by him herself. She's waiting for you. Helen's friend, Anne Rhodes, came forward, wearing black, looking so patient and gentle. Helen hugged her tightly, feeling tears in her eyes. I'm glad you came, said Anne softly. I want you to sit with me. I have something to say while I can. She held Helen's hand, the one that held Sylvie's hand when he was dying. Such love, such kindness. I never knew people could be so good. I want you to tell everyone who did something for my little boy, or even thought about it, that I will never forget them. I will always ask God to bless them. I prayed today, asking God to show me how to help others, so the world is better because my child lived, and I had such joy. You won't forget. I won't, said Helen. She held Anne close, and they sat in silence as it grew dark, while moonlight from the next room shone on the peaceful face of little Sylvie, whose life brought love and whose memory touched everyone's heart.